What if a small fishing boat lost off the coast of Maui one bright morning in 1979 did not simply vanish, but turned up nearly a decade later on a remote Pacific sandbar more than 2,300 miles away? That is the paradox at the heart of the Sarah Joe story. A routine outing from Hana on February 11, 1979, 5 men leaving for an ordinary day, a sudden and violent storm, a massive but fruitless search, and then, on September 10, 1988, a battered fiberglass hull and human remains found on Sibylla Island in the Marshall Islands. The gulf between those two moments, a small Hawaiian community holding its breath in the aftermath of disappearance, and an isolated atoll providing a single baffling clue years later, is where this mystery lives. Hana is not a place most maps expect you to linger. Perched on the windward edge of Maui, it is stitched together by a single road that winds through rainforests, waterfalls, and narrow cliffs. To the people who lived there, isolation was part of daily life. To the ocean that hugged them, it meant exposure. The Alinuihaha Channel, the stretch of water between Maui and the Big Island, has a reputation earned over generations. Sudden squalls, vicious wind funnels, currents that can tease a small craft apart in minutes. It is the channel sailors speak of in low voices, the place where weather that seems benign an hour inland can become merciless offshore. The Sarah Joe was an unremarkable boat by any measure, a small fiberglass vessel used for near-shore fishing. On the morning of February 11, 1979, 5 men left Hana with the sort of easy confidence that comes from growing up with the ocean as a neighbor. They were not strangers to risk. Their names would come to be repeated in a town stunned into silence. Pat Wessner, Peter Hanchett, Benny Callama, Scott Moorman, and Ralph Malayakini, who was aboard the boat that day and whose family ties to the Sarah Joe ran close. His twin brother Robert owned the vessel. They intended a short trip, something familiar and ordinary, the kind of outing that feeds families and communities. The weather, however, turned in a manner that has been described by residents and officials alike as sudden and severe. Witnesses on shore remembered a quick darkening of the sky, a squall that seemed to rise from nowhere. In that narrow window, something aboard the Sarah Joe changed the course of 5 lives and of an entire community's future. There are reported claims of a radio transmission, a fragmentary distress call relayed by someone on shore, but accounts differ, and the Coast Guard, which launched the official search and rescue, did not corroborate every detail that circulated among families. What is not disputed is that a search response was initiated. Cutters, aircraft, and local volunteers moved into the channel, combing the water and the ragged shoreline that could swallow a man or a boat without leaving a trace. The scale of the search reflected the urgency. The Coast Guard scrambled assets appropriate for a multi-person search in a hazardous channel. The local community held its breath and sent small vessels and people who knew those waters best. Yet despite wide-ranging efforts over days, no sign of the Sarah Joe or its crew was found. The ocean, in its vastness, can offer both rescue and erasure. In Hana, grief and frustration grew together. Families demanded answers and action, and the official narrative of the search would later be subject to criticism and second-guessing. One brother remembered the agonizing waiting, describing the days as a blur of boats and prayers, while officials defended the scope and constraints of their operations. When the search wound down, hope turned into a different kind of vigil, a prolonged waiting with no new leads. The community erected a memorial. Names were spoken in hushed tones at gatherings. The absence of closure became a communal wound. Over the years that followed, rumors collected at the edges of fact, possible sightings, whispered theories about storms, and conjectures about drift, but none rose to the level of confirmation. Time did not heal the question mark. The families of the missing men lived with a persistent uncertainty that is often harder to bear than a known loss. Nearly a decade after that fateful morning, on September 10, 1988, the ocean offered a fragmentary answer in a place nobody imagined. Sibylla Island is part of the Marshall Islands archipelago, a remoteness of sand and reef far into the central Pacific, where human traffic is minimal and nature keeps company with a few hardy researchers and bird colonies. It was there that marine biologist John Norton, working with a small team surveying remote atolls, noticed a hull poking above the sand, a battered sliver of fiberglass improbably far from Hawaii. He knew from the curve of lettering and the stenciled registration that clung like a ghost to the keel, enough to suspect a Hawaiian origin. The hull just didn't belong there, Norton recalled later. We were standing on a place where boats normally never arrive. The letters on the transom, the style, it stopped us in our tracks. He called local authorities, and Marshallese researchers joined the effort, and once the hull was approached, the scene became both technical and profoundly human. Inside and near the wreckage were remains that hinted at a person long removed from that home community in Hana. Among the finds were not only bone fragments that would later undergo forensic testing, but also artifacts whose presence would complicate any neat crossing of dots. A small stack of folded paper, not unlike the bundles used in East Asian funeral customs, and a cross fashioned from driftwood and held together with nails. Forensic work followed the discovery with the sober, meticulous pace that such cases demand. Remains recovered from remote atolls are fragile testimony to time, sun, salt, and biological processes that complicate identification. The Army Identification Lab, the forensic group charged with the task, compared dental records and other anatomical clues against known missing person files. Dental comparisons, a mainstay of post-mortem identification where other markers have degraded, yielded a match. One set of remains could be positively identified as Scott Mormon. That identification is a fixed point in the case. It is not conjecture. Dental records matched, and the lab issued its conclusion. Even with that confirmation, the discovery raised more questions than answers. If one of the 5 men had been identified nearly a decade after the disappearance, where were the others? How had a Hawaiian registration ended up on a hull lodged in a Marshallese lagoon? The physical context of the find provoked immediate technical and intuitive puzzles. The hull had not washed up on the windward ocean side of an island facing the open Pacific. Instead, it was tucked into a lagoon. That detail matters. Entry into a lagoon requires specific conditions or human intervention, and it is not a simple endpoint for a craft drifting on open ocean currents. Forensic observers also noted signs on the bones and the hull that did not align neatly with a 9-year exposure to open elements. Some bleaching patterns and surface conditions suggested a different timeline or a combination of environments over years rather than continuous exposure in the open sea. Before Norton's team arrived, other survey groups had visited Sibylla and nearby atolls. Their records, reviewed after the discovery, showed no sign of a hull or a makeshift grave where the remains were found. This absence of prior mention deepened the mystery. Either the hull and the burial were recent additions to the island ecology, or they had been overlooked, or some sequence of human agency had moved material where it came to rest. None of these possibilities was comforting. Each opened another chain of uncertainties. Local Marshallese researchers who helped document the site were careful in their descriptions, mindful of cultural practice and the need to treat human remains with respect. The presence of folded paper bundles, often associated with ceremonial burials in some East Asian fishing cultures, would later be pointed to by investigators as possible evidence of burial by passing fishermen. Specifically, the theory raised by private investigator Steve Goodenow that offshore Taiwanese longline vessels operating in distant Pacific waters might have stopped, buried the remains ashore, and continued. If true, such a practice would reflect a pragmatic and culturally codified response to death, far from home, a way to provide some ritual closure when returning a body to port or transporting it across noisy sea lanes was not feasible. But in the realm of evidence, ritual artifacts are ambiguous. They can mean different things in different contexts, and their presence does not definitively name the hands that placed them. Simpler physical clues complicated the narrative further. An engine later located wedged against a reef near the lagoon, a heavy piece that could tell a current story if its position and damage were correctly interpreted, suggested violent interaction with reef structures at some point in the vessel's journey. Hair fibers and small bone fragments within the hull's cavity hinted that at least one occupant had been aboard when some portion of the events occurred, though the exact chronology of deposition would require more than surface observation. Norton's initial notes described a scene of things layered upon things, hull material, biological remnant, objects with cultural resonance, and a surrounding environment that made the simple story of drift and stranding inadequate. To understand the plausibility of drift over long distances, it helps to consider in one clear line how surface currents and winds can move a floating object. A boat without propulsion will generally be acted upon by the combined effects of wind pushing at its exposed surfaces, currents driven by large-scale ocean circulation patterns, and near-surface eddies that can trap or accelerate debris. The exact path is highly contingent on where a vessel is disabled, storm vectors encountered, and time spent exposed to conditions that favor disintegration versus intact drift. This is why investigators model drift, using both historical wind records and contemporary knowledge of oceanic gyres and current systems, and why timelines for transoceanic drift are given as estimates, often with wide ranges. Even with that understanding, it strains credulity to picture a small Gulf of Hawaii vessel simply riding the Pacific for years and then arriving, intact enough to display its registration, in a sheltered lagoon on a distant atoll. Yet the physical evidence was there: lettering, registration traces, a hull form consistent with what had been known of Sarah Joe. The presence of a single positively identified crew member among the remains added a human center to the technical puzzle. For the families back in Hana, the discovery reframed grief with a sharp, intrusive specificity. Scott, once missing in name and memory, was now named by science. That naming did not close the story. It reopened it in ways that sharpened the ache. Community reaction on Maui was immediate when the news filtered back. Hana's residents, who had carried the silence of those missing for 9 years, were confronted with confirmation and contradiction at once. Some expressed relief that at least one man had been identified. Others could not reconcile the island's memory of a single sudden loss with the idea of a body moved and buried thousands of miles away. Robert, the twin brother of Ralph and the registered owner of the Sarah Joe, would later be called upon to confirm identification features of the craft and to reconcile his own memories with the object that had wandered across the sea. For families, the hull's sighting transformed speculation into a physical thing they could point to. But it also posed logistical and emotional dilemmas: how to retrieve a piece of home from a foreign shore, how to receive a loved one whose death had not been witnessed, how to accept a fragment of certainty as a comfort. Questions piled up as investigators began to pull lines through the evidence. Why did prior surveys of Sibylla fail to note a hull or shallow burial? Had the hull been recently moved into the lagoon, perhaps floated or hauled over a reef by people, or had it been there but small and covered, escaping earlier notice? Could bleaching on bone indicate a shorter period of exposure than 9 years, suggesting the remains arrived later? If Scott's remains were buried by passing fishermen, what explains the absence of the other 4 men's remains or any additional wreckage? Each possibility carried with it practical and evidentiary consequences. For families pressing for answers, these were not idle hypotheses but directions in which investigations might move. Investigators also recognized that the ocean is not a simple conveyor belt. Objects can beach, be later refloated by storms, be pulled out by changing sandbars, and be moved shoreward by high tides and human activity. The reef structures around atolls like Sibylla create complex hydrodynamic behavior. Sometimes a craft can be smashed onto a reef crest and held there. Other times, a storm surge can temporarily allow passage into a lagoon on an otherwise closed shore. These dynamics gave plausible routes for how a hull might end up inside a lagoon, rather than on an exposed seaward shoreline, but they did not fully account for the absence of survey reports describing the hull earlier. By the time official reports reached the families and the public, the story had changed from a straightforward search and rescue record into a layered investigation that would span jurisdictions, cultures, and oceans. The Marshallese authorities documented the site and coordinated with the visiting researchers. American forensic teams performed analyses. Private investigators began to survey drift paths and interview distant seafarers. The multinational nature of evidence, a Hawaiian registration, Marshallese discovery, possible Taiwanese fishing practices observed in other parts of the Pacific, made the case an archival and logistical knot. Each thread added to the picture, but also exposed seams where certainty frayed. One recurrent image that haunted people in Hana was of a small cross made from driftwood and nailed imperfectly together. It had been found near the burial and was later described by those who saw it as a makeshift marker, a human act of recognition placed where the ocean had left a person. For the families, that cross was both a comfort and a burden, a human acknowledgement in a place that for years had been only ocean. But the cross, like the stack of folded paper, did not declare the nationality or intent of those who had left it. It existed as contextual evidence, evocative, potentially meaningful, but not a closed argument. The discovery on Sibylla created a complex chain of evidence, and it is important to emphasize what is established and what is conjecture. It is a verified fact, supported by the forensic laboratory, that dental records matched the remains to Scott Moorman. That identification anchors the case. It is also a fact that a hull with visible Hawaiian registration marks was found on the island on September 10, 1988, and that certain items consistent with funeral practice were present near the burial site. Beyond those points, several hypotheses emerge as investigators and family members attempt to bridge thousands of miles and years of silence. Some of these hypotheses are plausible, given known patterns of drift, human behavior at sea, and fishing practices in the Pacific. Others remain speculative until corroborated by independent evidence. As the initial wave of documentation and forensic work wound down in the Marshall Islands, attention began to turn back to the possibilities that could account for the skeletal, geographic, and documentary facts. Could the Sarah Jo have been disabled in the Alenuihaha Channel and drifted for a relatively short period before being intercepted by a commercial fishing vessel? Could men have been transferred to another vessel or island, with only one body ever left behind? Or did the hull itself travel long distances intact and only later become lodged in a lagoon where burial by local or passing hands occurred? Each line of inquiry required expertise: oceanographers to model possible drift paths, forensic pathologists to read bone weathering and bleaching patterns, cultural researchers to interpret artifacts like folded paper bundles in the context of Pacific and East Asian maritime practices. None of these avenues promised a neat resolution. The sea does not yield linear narratives easily. What would become clear in the months of investigation that followed the Sibylla discovery was that practical, forensically grounded explanations could be assembled into plausible scenarios, but that none of them eliminated competing possibilities or the fundamental sense of dislocation at the case's core: a Hawaiian boat, this side of 3,000 miles, materializing in an unimaginable place. If the discovery on Sibylla had the effect of making absence visible, it did not make silence answerable. For the families in Hana, the identification of Scott was a mixture of relief and renewed pain. For researchers like John Norton, it was a moment that turned fieldwork into a touchstone for a wider investigation. For the wider public, the image of a boat from a tranquil Hawaiian harbor discovered on a remote Marshallese sandbar became a story that resisted simple closure. It posed logistical questions about jurisdiction and recovery, forensic questions about post-mortem processes in tropical settings, and human questions about ritual and the obligations of seafarers to those they find at sea. As investigators prepared to trace currents, interview distant crews, and test the hypothesis that the hull arrived via complex drift and human intervention, other facts continued to prick holes in a straightforward narrative. Earlier surveys had left no record. Some bleaching on bones suggested a different timescale than continuous exposure since 1979. Only one of 5 men had been identified, despite a thorough search of the hull and surrounding area. Those inconsistencies would turn out to be the case's engine. Each contradiction compelled further inquiry. In the months to come, private investigators would build models and chase interviews across the Pacific. The families would wait a second time for answers that might not come. For now, the scene on Sibylla remained a tableau of uncertainty: a hull half buried in sand, an improvised cross, folded paper bundles, a jawbone that carried a name back to Hana. The ocean had returned a fragment of a narrative, but it had not completed the sentence. If you find stories like this compelling, consider subscribing for more investigative narratives that follow evidence across oceans and decades. The next phase of investigation would attempt to stitch the physical clues into a plausible sequence, reconstructing drift using oceanographic models, examining reef damage and engine placement, and interrogating the cultural meaning of the artifacts found alongside the remains. It would be a painstaking effort drawing on expertise from different disciplines and cultural perspectives. It would also open up avenues of contradiction, survey records that denied the presence of a hull, observations about bone bleaching incompatible with a 9-year exposure, and questions about why no other bodies or significant debris were recovered. Each of these anomalies demanded explanation. In tracing how a hull might travel from the Alenuihaha Channel to the Central Pacific, investigators would need to account for the variability of surface currents and storm events. The North Equatorial Current and the trade winds can conspire to carry floating objects westward across vast stretches of ocean. Seasonal shifts and episodic storms can thrust them south or north. But long-range drift is not just a function of steady motion. It is punctuated by storms that can beach debris on exposed shores, by reef interactions that damage propulsion systems, and by human intervention, either salvage or, in some documented cases, the burial of remains by passing crews. Any model that seeks to explain the Sarah Joe's fate must therefore be probabilistic, not deterministic, noting what is more likely rather than insisting on a single path. At the same time, the cultural artifacts found at the site demand careful interpretation. The folded paper bundles have analogues in certain fishing cultures as memorial offerings. They can indicate a ritualized acknowledgement of death by seafarers who cannot return a body home. But their presence in a Marshallese lagoon cannot be automatically read as proof of Taiwanese fishermen. Paper offerings travel as easily as driftwood, and local practices can sometimes include borrowed elements. Sensitivity to cultural nuance is essential when drawing conclusions from such objects. As planners and investigators sketched the next steps, families in Hana watched history repeat itself in miniature, a second waiting period, another institutional choreography of reports and tests, another attempt to translate physical evidence into human meaning. If the discovery on Sibylla had given one person a name again, it had also reawakened the absence of answers for the other 4, and for the family and friends who had lived in limbo for nearly a decade. What followed would involve a private investigator named Steve Goodenow, who would later set out to model drift paths and interrogate the peculiarities of the site, forensic teams tasked with interpreting bone weathering and bleaching, and Marshallese officials who would balance respect for local sites with cooperation across international lines. But those efforts lay beyond that first daylight on Sibylla, when the hull was recognized and the first human identification was made. The discovery had opened a door into a history that would prove stubbornly resistant to tidy explanation. The questions that remained after that September day in 1988 were both technical and existential. Technically, how could a hull with Hawaiian markings end up inside a lagoon where earlier surveys recorded nothing? What does the pattern of damage to the engine and hull indicate about the vessel's final encounter with reef structures? How do bleaching and surface wear on bone correspond to exposure in an equatorial lagoon versus years in open ocean? Existentially, how does a small community absorb the knowledge that one of its sons was found so far from home, and how do we, as observers and narrators, reckon with an event that resists finality? On Sibylla, the sea kept its vast, placid indifference. On Maui, a community that had already learned to carry its grief with quiet strength faced the return of a name and the reshape of a narrative. The hull, the cross, the paper bundles, and the jawbone together formed a puzzle that was at once technical and tender. They demanded more than imagination. They required disciplined inquiry and cultural care. The path forward would thread through ocean models, interviews with distant fishermen, and further forensic analysis. It would also require patience from families and patience from the public watching from afar. For the Sarah Joe and the men who had set out from Hana on a morning that should have been routine, the sea had written a partial sentence. The remaining words were not yet legible. What followed the initial discovery was not a tidy closure, but a second, more methodical stage of searching, this time through reports, currents, metal fatigue, and cultural practice. The raw drama of a hull on a sandbar gave way to work that is quiet, repetitive and exacting. Measuring the angle of reef scours, cataloguing the patterns of staining on bone, tracing the faint stenciling on a transom, and asking seamen far from Hana what they might have seen. The private investigator, Steve Goodenow, would become central to that effort. He arrived at the problem with a particular focus. If the Sarah Joe could not plausibly have sat unattended for 9 continuous years and then washed into a lagoon intact, what other pathways might have placed a Hawaiian hull and a single burial on Sibylla? Goodenow's approach combined field observation with pragmatic reconstruction. He examined the engine found embedded in the reef near the lagoon. He documented damage to the hull, and he spoke with Marshallese officials, visiting researchers, and, when possible, fishermen who traveled those stretches of sea. One of his starting points was the engine. Its presence and position signaled violence with the reef. Engines do not gently settle. They are heavy appendages that, when slammed into coral, fracture and gouge in ways that preserve a record of impact. Goodenow argued that the engine's damage suggested a relatively forceful encounter with reef structures, something that, in his assessment, could have occurred well after 1979, had the craft been moved, towed, or otherwise handled in intervening years. The engine, wedged near a reef crest, could have become detached from a hull that had been carried ashore, or it might have been cast loose during a grounding. Either interpretation allowed for shorter timelines of exposure than the 9-year gap between disappearance and discovery might imply. Goodenow also considered the small but telling items found with the remains. The square stacks of folded paper folded in a way observers likened to offerings sometimes used in East Asian funeral practice, and the driftwood cross fastened with nails presented the possibility of a ritual burial performed by individuals who encountered the remains ashore. Goodenow proposed a plausible sequence. A commercial fishing vessel, perhaps unable to return a body to port for reasons of distance, logistics, or law, might have taken the practical step of burying what they found ashore and leaving a small token of recognition. This was not framed as accusation. Rather, it was an interpretive hypothesis that attempted to reconcile human practice with the physical facts. To test whether the hull could have arrived after only months at sea, Goodenow and others examined oceanographic behavior and modeled likely drift patterns. Using known behavior of the North Equatorial Current and trade wind influences, they constructed probabilistic paths. One working estimate that emerged from those models suggested a drift period measured in months, perhaps 2 to 3 months, rather than years. This estimate is properly framed as an investigator's calculation. It is contingent on assumptions about where the vessel was disabled, the configuration of sails or canopy left exposed to wind, and episodic storm tracks that can dramatically alter a floating object's trajectory. In short, drift modeling yields likelihoods, not certainties. If a 2 to 3 month drift were plausible, it opened alternative narratives that might relieve the strain of imagining a hull surviving intact through nearly a decade of open ocean battering. In Goodenow's scenario, the Sarah Joe could have been disabled in the Channel in 1979, set adrift or otherwise left at sea, and encountered commercial traffic in the Western Pacific within months. A commercial vessel, perhaps engaged in long-line operations far from port, might have intercepted debris and made decisions about what to do with a human corpse found adrift or on shore. Such a sequence would account for the presence of ritual papers and a small cross, and it would reconcile some of the bleaching inconsistencies by positing periods of burial and re-exposure rather than continuous sun-bleaching over 9 years. There are reasons to treat that hypothesis cautiously. The Marshallese surveys that preceded the September 1988 discovery had recorded no hull and no shallow burial at Sibylla. Those surveys, made by researchers who had traversed nearby atolls, might have missed an object if it was small or if sand had hidden it. But multiple independent surveys with no mention at all raise a real problem for any account that places the hull on Sibylla for a long, unobserved period. If the hull had been present for years, it seems likely someone would have noted it sooner. That silence pushes a timeline toward being shorter, or toward a scenario involving human transport into the lagoon after arrival. Technical analysis of the bones offered further complication. Forensic examiners noted patterns of bleaching and surface wear, not entirely consistent with continuous exposure since 1979. In tropical settings, bone bleaching can accelerate under intense sunlight and in the presence of alkaline sand and salt spray, but it can also be arrested if the remains are buried or shaded. The Army Identification Lab's dental identification of Scott remains the immovable fact here. Dental comparison matched the jaw to Scott Moorman. Beyond that, however, weathering patterns suggested intervals of burial and re-exposure could not be ruled out. In plain terms, the bones condition did not definitively confirm a 9-year continuous interval on an exposed sandbar. The absence of the other 4 crew members at the Sibylla site deepened the sense of partial answers. If a fishing crew operating near the hull had buried what they found and left, did they take others? Did some men die elsewhere and their remains sink, scatter, or be taken ashore on a different island? Could some have been transferred to another vessel? Here, investigators moved into terrain of plausible human behavior rather than strict physical tracing. Longline crews are known to practice a pragmatic, sometimes improvised code of responses when confronting death far from home. A burial ashore, a token left, or a note kept in a log. But those practices differ across cultures and crews, and the presence of a paper bundle does not on its own identify nationality or obligate a single conclusion. Goodenow and other investigators sought corroborating testimony. They queried mariners who plied the mid-Pacific in those years, checked logbooks when available, and looked for records of Taiwanese longline operations in the general area during the months after the Sarah Joe's disappearance. Testimony could be fragmentary, memory fallible, and formal records scarce. Some fishermen are reluctant to speak about sensitive matters. Others did not recall seeing a small hull, and in many cases, time had thinned direct knowledge. The investigatory record thus accumulated plausible connections alongside stubborn gaps. Another set of puzzling facts involved the hull's position within the island's lagoon, rather than the exposed ocean face. Reefs can act as both barriers and gateways. During certain high-surge events or with specific swell angles, a floating object might be pushed over reef crests into a lagoon, especially if the reef geometry allows a temporary channel or during exceptionally high tides combined with storm surge. Human action could also be involved. Someone landing the hull through a pass, hauling it across a reef flat during high tide, or dragging it into shelter, which, if any, of these mechanisms operated on Sibylla, is unknown. The variety of potential physical routes into a lagoon again emphasizes that multiple causal chains can fit the observed geometry. It does not furnish a single locked solution. Marshallese officials and field researchers acted with a particular care toward cultural and legal considerations. The discovery occurred on land under Marshallese sovereignty, and decisions about exhumation, documentation, and repatriation required consultation and sensitivity. For the Marshallese, the site was both a research locus and a place deserving respect. For American investigators and families in Hana, it represented an evidentiary link to their missing. Those dual commitments sometimes complicated rapid conclusions. Excavation and forensic processes must balance the needs of science with local protocols around human remains and sacred spaces, an often delicate negotiation that can slow the pace of public answers without diminishing the rigor of the work. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the mosaic of evidence slowly accrued. Hair fragments and small bone pieces recovered from inside the hull cavity indicated human presence in close association with the wreckage at some point. Tool marks and nail types on the driftwood cross were catalogued. Observers noted that commercially available nails are commonly used across vessels in the Pacific, which again made attribution to a particular nationality or fleet impossible on the basis of nails alone. The paper bundles were carefully documented, photographed, and compared with known funerary forms. Similarities with East Asian offerings were suggestive, but not dispositive. Throughout this period, the families in Hana remained a presence in the narrative, not mere passive recipients of forensic reports. They visited, corresponded, and pressed for clarity. Robert, who owned the Sarah Joe, was involved in confirming identifying features of the hull when photographs reached him. He would later receive artifacts from the wreck and from the island as part of efforts to return pieces of home to those who had lost them. Those returned artifacts have meaning beyond their material value. They are touchstones in a grieving process that, until the dental identification of Scott, had no named remains to anchor mourning. The emotional labor of holding memory in uncertainty is as important to recount as any technical detail. Families described living decades with an absent answer. A name returned by science altered that landscape, but did not erase the absence of witnesses or the lack of a definitive, narratively satisfying end. For a small community like Hana, where relationships are dense and histories overlap, the partial identification produced both relief and anger. Relief at knowing that one son had been named, and anger at the layers of unanswered questions that remained. Some criticized agencies for perceived delays, others cautioned restraint, noting that boundless speculation could harm the dignity of the dead and the privacy of survivors. As investigators wrestled with the contradictions, missing survey mentions, bleaching patterns that resisted a single timeline, a hull tucked into a lagoon rather than exposed to open ocean, a few cautious syntheses emerged. One plausible scenario, advanced in some form by investigators, runs like this. The Sarah Joe was disabled in the Alenwihaha Channel during a storm in February 1979 and set adrift. Within weeks to months it drifted westward, under the influence of prevailing currents and intermittent storms. Along its path it may have been intercepted, perhaps by commercial fishing traffic. At some later point, either through natural processes or human agency, the hull came to rest on or near Sibylla. Someone buried the remains ashore and left modest tokens. The burial and the hull's eventual placement in the lagoon could have occurred within a shorter time span than a continuous 9-year exposure would imply. That chain would reconcile some physical observations, but would not answer why previous surveys recorded nothing, or why no other crew were identified at the site. Even where an explanatory thread seems to knit some facts together, it leaves loose ends. If some crew had been buried elsewhere or retrieved, records of their funerals or repatriations might exist. If men had been transferred to another vessel, there may be logs or testimonies. Decades of time, relenting memories, incomplete records, and the mobility of crews across vast ocean spaces conspire to make that sort of corroboration rare. Goodenough's work, detailed and earnest, stitched a plausible tapestry but could not produce a final verdict. The investigators' hypothesis remained exactly that, a reasoned narrative designed to make physical and cultural evidence cohere, not a legal determination or an irrefutable reconstruction. The salient fact remains fixed amid these interpretive moves. Scott Moorman was identified by dental records, and his remains were part of what was found on Sibylla on September 10, 1988. That identification transforms a name lost in 1979 into a person known again. It is both a scientific closure and an emotional reopening. The rest of the crew, Pat Wessner, Peter Hanchett, Benny Kalama and Ralph Malaya Keeney, remain missing from the public record in the sense of not having remains linked to them through the Sibylla discovery. Their absence is a human ache that no model can resolve. The case also illuminates broader truths about the ocean and those who work upon it. The sea is an arena of practical morality. Decisions must sometimes be made quickly and under conditions that offer no comfortable options. Long-range fishing operations in the late 20th century were a maritime reality. Cultures and crews developed informal practices when confronted with death far from home. The presence of symbolic items on Sibylla might be interpreted in that light, as gestures of acknowledgement performed by hands who could not perform otherwise. Compassion across language and national boundaries is possible, even if the documentary record is thin. There remain procedural and documentary questions that have not been answered. Why did earlier surveys fail to note the hull? Was the hull moved to the lagoon after initial beaching? Were any logs or reports by commercial vessels cross-checked comprehensively? Did oceanographic reconstructions adequately account for episodic storm events? Some of these questions can be further investigated, others may forever be subject to the limits of surviving records and the partialities of human memory. What is certain beyond reasonable dispute is the human cost. The families in Hana continue to carry the absence of those 5 men. Public memorials and private rituals attest to the community's ongoing work of remembrance. Objects returned from Sibylla, fragments of fiberglass, personal artifacts, photographs, sit in the hands of relatives as small, tactile bridges to a time and place that the sea had occluded. The cultural meaning of those objects, their capacity to hold memory and to anchor mourning, cannot be reduced to forensic significance. The Sarah Jo story ends, if it ends at all, in a space that resists closure. We have evidence that places a Hawaiian hull and the remains of one man on a Marshallese sandbar in 1988. We have forensic certainty about the identity of that man, and we have plausibly reasoned hypotheses about how the boat might have traveled and how a burial could have occurred. We also have inconsistencies that keep probability from becoming certainty. Survey silence, bone-bleaching patterns that complicate long-term exposure narratives, the lagoon's unexpected harboring of a hull, and the unrecovered status of 4 men. In the final account, the title's paradox remains the story's beating heart. A small fishing boat launched from Hana on a routine morning, lost in a violent storm, and then, years later, discovered in an unimaginable place more than 2,300 miles away. That paradox is not a flourish but a factual tension, a convergence of geography, human action, ocean dynamics, and cultural practice that refuses to yield a single, neat narrative. For families, investigators, and communities, the work of memory continues in different registers. Some press for additional archival searches and interviews, others tend memorials and gather annually to speak names. Robert kept artifacts that tied home to sea, others kept photographs and stories that keep place and person united. In the Marshall Islands, the discovery remains a recorded event in the history of island research, a moment when fieldwork encountered lived human history in an unexpected way. If there is a final image to leave with, it is simple and resonant. A battered transom half buried in sand, the faint ghost of Hawaiian lettering, a small cross hammered clumsily from driftwood, and a folded paper bundle whose origin may never be conclusively known. That grouping sits at the intersection of grief and curiosity, ritual and practicality, science and mystery. It is both a confirmation and a question. The Sarah Jo case teaches a caution that is useful for anyone who follows mysteries like this. Evidence can point powerfully and precisely to certain facts, dental identification, physical presence, documented discovery, while also resisting a total narrative that satisfies all emotional and evidentiary needs. The ocean's scale and indifference, human mobility and improvisation, and the limits of archive and memory make for investigations that are often probabilistic rather than definitive. If you want to explore the documentary sources and follow-up materials that informed this account, links to primary documents, interviews, and investigative reports are available in the description. If this story moved you, consider supporting further investigative pieces through the channel's membership options or Patreon. Your support helps sustain careful, respectful work that follows evidence across oceans and years. In the end, the mystery stays with us. A Hawaiian boat in an unimaginable place, carrying a human fragment back into daylight, naming a man who was once only a question. The facts give us a thread to hold, dates, names, a forensic identification, and through that thread we trace both a tragedy and a testament to how communities endure. The sea returned a part of a story. It did not return the whole. The remainder is held in memory, in inquiry, and in the patient work of those who will not let absence stand unchallenged.